Matt Kinoshita. Now he was a country farmer from Arkansas in a past life. He loves old trucks, big dogs, country music, boots bourbon, and girls named Gretchen. Let's hear it from you, mate. Matt!
Good morning.
Good morning.
I wanted to preface this by saying, the title of my talk, Repealing Prohibition, was in no way inspired by the fact that I attend these meetings of a secret society at 7 a.m. in a bar. It's been hard to try to explain that, but anyway. There was a time in our nation's history where, enjoying a glass of wine or sitting down with a friend and having a pint, it would have been considered criminal. I certainly would have been considered a criminal. So the question begs, how did the United States of America, how did our country, a nation founded on the principles of liberty and freedom, criminalize a beverage that had been a part of civilization for the past 9,000 years? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through, I'm first going to explain Prohibition. I'm going to talk about how this occurred, the zeitgeist of the times. I'll talk a little bit about the effects of Prohibition. So how did Prohibition occur? We have to understand a little bit about the times to understand how something like this could have happened. Our enemy at the time, all of our foreign policy efforts were focused toward Germany. We were exiting, or we were kind of in the time where World War I was still fresh on the minds of many Americans. So the enemies of our nation was actually Germany. And names like Pabst, Schlitz, Miller, you might recognize as breweries, well, those were, quote unquote, the tools of the Kaiser. So, kind of an interesting fact. In addition to that, we had a very strong racial component that was running through our nation at the time as well. Distilleries during that time were largely Jewish-owned, managed, and run. The Catholics in urban areas were largely Irish and Italian immigrants who brought their cultures and wonderful beverages with them. Another component to this was, as a result of the abolition of slavery, one of the big fears of the rest of America was the image of, quote, an African American with a ballot in one hand and a bottle in the other. So in an effort to keep America white, I discovered that, if we want something like that agenda to continue in our country, white, Protestant, Anglo-Saxon, we can help that along by asking our brothers from the KKK to try and push something like that along. Another big piece that helped move Prohibition along was women's suffrage. The saloon culture was maturing during that time. Only men were allowed to walk into a bar. It was not customary at all for women to leave the home. So men would go out, they drink their money away, come home hammered, beat their wife, abuse their children, bring home venereal diseases, and not surprisingly, women had enough. So from there sprung the suffrage, along with the suffrage movement and increasing rights of women, came this push to slam the door on alcohol. So now that we had all this happen and there was an amendment to our Constitution which actually prohibited it, what were some of the effects? A really interesting effect from this was something that I'm sure none of us like at all, and that was income tax. Our nation was largely funded by excise taxes based on alcohol, the sales of alcohol, and in fact funded much of all of our previous wars during that, prior to this time. So with taking away that source of revenue, the only way to come up with additional revenue was to create another tax. That became income tax, which we still have today. I don't think, a big problem. In addition to that, there was this undercurrent of hypocrisy that certainly ran through the country. I don't think any of us like hypocrisy. One of the things that really stood out to me were some of the loopholes in the law. These are kind of amusing. For example, farmers were allowed to preserve their fruit. If we understand anything about the process of fermentation, you can basically take any sort of natural vegetable or fruit that has any sort of sugar. You can make alcohol from it. So a farmer who had an apple orchard would take those rotten apples, allow them to ferment, and keep those the results of that through the long, hard winter. Liquor was available for medicinal purposes to treat what was called debility. What that means, I have no idea, but doctors were writing prescriptions for debility. And the other interesting loophole to the law was that wine was allowed in church, and I can think of no other more appropriate place to have alcohol than in the house of God. So, essentially, we had a bunch of hypocrisy that surrounded this issue. There were other people called the wet dries, people that would publicly support prohibition, yet openly be drinking and talking about how stupid it actually was. Organized crime also sprung from prohibition. It actually became much more organized than it previously was. They controlled a lot of the black markets in any vacuum, but what happened was anytime you got to move large amounts of product across the country, you needed a sender and a receiver, and that helped really tie the bonds of organized crime during that time. So now, let me tie this up and talk about how history might be repeating itself. As an economic determinist, I really think about what's happening. This came about also during the time of the Great Depression, where people were unemployed. We needed tax revenue to help support the social, a lot of our social programs in our country. I would suggest, just for food for thought, we have something coming up in November that is very similar to this with the legalization of marijuana. Perhaps some of the pieces that went into place with repealing prohibition might be in play here. Thank you.
Let's hear it from me, Matt. Hey, come on, let's hear it. Yay, Matt, thank you.